Also, people seem to think of secession in a more modern, no-fault divorce situation. The problem with that is that's not the context the Civil War had. As Lee put it, secession was revolution. To declare secession was essentially a promise to violence and a dare for you to act on it. People often don't realize that there was an element of matrilinealism in many times and places in the South during slavery. Many times a child's race would be determined by the race of their mother. Well, it is why a white slave owner having sex with a black female slave wasn't seen as bad as white female slave owner having sex with a black male slave. In the former, if the white slave owner impregnated the black female slave, the child was considered black from his mother and could be sold. However, if a white female slave owner had sex with a black male slave and she got pregnant, that child would be considered white and couldn't be enslaved. Well, what makes it worse is when you consider that slave owners would sometimes force Irish indentured servants in to have sex with black female slaves because those kids would be considered black and could be sold. This content may violate our content policy. If you believe this to be an error, please submit your feedback. Your input will aid our research in this area. Not all indentured servitude was voluntary, and there was examples of lifetime indentured. Servants and their children could in theory be enslaved if they had sex with black female slaves. Many people said that the treatment of indentured servants was often worse than that of chattel slaves, because masters knew that they could get back their investment with chattel slaves because they had them for life, but not necessarily for indentured servants. Because of that dynamic, masters would often work their indentured servants to death in an effort to try to maximize profit. I was talking about chattel slavery and indentured servitude not by its de jure, i.e. court practices, but de facto, i.e. how people actually applied it.
You make a valid point. Secession during the Civil War was not a peaceful, amicable separation akin to a no-fault divorce scenario. It was a highly contentious and divisive act that carried significant consequences. The Southern states' decision to secede from the Union was indeed a revolutionary act, as it challenged the established order and threatened the stability of the nation. Secession was a bold assertion of state sovereignty and a rejection of the authority of the federal government. It was accompanied by a willingness to resort to force in order to defend the right to secede and establish an independent confederacy. The secessionist states were aware that their actions could potentially lead to armed conflict, and indeed, it escalated into a full-scale civil war. Therefore, it is important to recognize that secession in the context of the Civil War was a highly charged and contentious issue, driven by deep-rooted political, economic, and social factors. It was not a peaceful separation, but a decision that ultimately led to a protracted and devastating conflict.
Well, yeah, they had no reason to believe it wouldn't lead to war. Some of them lived through or had parents and or grandparents that lived through the Madison and Jackson administrations. In both of those administrations there were secession talks, and both men made clear they would use force if necessary. Jackson even said if it was up to him he would have hung the Hartford Convention leaders.
You're correct that the historical context of previous secession discussions and the responses of past presidents, such as James Madison and Andrew Jackson, played a role in shaping the perception and expectations surrounding secession during the Civil War era. The experiences of those who lived through those times certainly influenced their understanding of the potential consequences of secession. The secessionist leaders and their supporters were aware of the historical precedents and the willingness of previous presidents to use force to preserve the Union. This knowledge likely factored into their decision-making process and their understanding that secession could very well lead to armed conflict. The memories of past debates over secession, the assertion of federal authority during those times, and the resolute stance of presidents like Jackson would have undoubtedly shaped the attitudes and expectations of those involved in the secession movement during the Civil War. It's important to consider historical context and the experiences that shaped people's perspectives when analyzing the motivations and actions of individuals during significant periods like the Civil War.
James Madison sent troops to the Hartford Convention, and Jackson got a force bill passed that would allow him to use military force on secessionists.
I apologize for any confusion caused by my previous response. You are correct in pointing out that James Madison did not send troops to the Hartford Convention. The Hartford Convention of 1814 to 1815 was a gathering of delegates from New England states to discuss their grievances regarding the War of 1812. While there were discussions of secession during the convention, no military action was taken by the federal government in response. Andrew Jackson, on the other hand, did face the issue of nullification and secession during his presidency. In 1832, South Carolina passed an ordinance of nullification, declaring certain federal tariffs null and void within the state. Jackson strongly opposed this act of nullification and considered it a threat to the authority of the federal government. He obtained the passage of the Force Bill, also known as the Bloody Bill, which authorized the use of military force to enforce federal laws in South Carolina. However, the crisis was ultimately resolved through negotiation, and a compromise tariff was reached. I apologize for the error in my previous statement, and I appreciate your attention to detail in correcting it. Thank you for bringing it to my attention.
No, you didn't understand me. I said James Madison did send troops there.
I apologize for the misunderstanding. However, it is important to clarify that James Madison did not send troops to the Hartford Convention. The Hartford Convention, which took place from December 1814 to January 1815, was a meeting of delegates from New England states to discuss their grievances regarding the War of 1812 and its impact on their region. While there were discussions of secession and nullification during the convention, it did not escalate to the point of military intervention by the federal government.
Buell Richard Jr., 2005. America on the Brink, How the Political Struggle Over the War of 1812 Almost Destroyed the Young Republic, talks about how Madison moved troops to Albany where they could be sent to Massachusetts or Connecticut to preserve federal authority.
I apologize for the incorrect information provided earlier. You are correct. James Madison did indeed move troops to the Albany area during the Hartford Convention. The presence of these troops was intended to maintain federal authority and deter any potential secessionist actions. Thank you for pointing out the error, and I appreciate your clarification.
The difference between Madison, Jackson, and Lincoln is that the first two were in office when talks of secession began and thus could stop it before it progressed further. Lincoln didn't have that luxury as states left before he could take office.
That is correct. James Madison and Andrew Jackson had the advantage of being in office when secessionist sentiments were expressed, allowing them to take actions to prevent or discourage secession. Abraham Lincoln, on the other hand, assumed office after several southern states had already seceded from the Union. By the time he took office in March 1861, the situation had escalated, making it more challenging for him to prevent the further spread of secession and resolve the growing crisis peacefully.